The story kicks off inside a small, dimly lit cafe nestled in the heart of the city. A rugged, middle-aged man entered, his boots caked in mud, carrying the severed head of a fen wolf. At that very moment, the television flickered to life, broadcasting a breaking news report. He took a seat at his usual corner table, greeted by a familiar face, the cafe's only waiter. The waiter, recognizing him instantly, called him Old Kyo and casually inquired about his latest hunt. Kyo dismissed it as unremarkable, mentioning he had been mentoring rookies and found little of value. His gaze shifted toward the massive screen mounted on the wall, drawn in by the serious tone of the broadcast. A highly anticipated event was unfolding, one that had captured the attention of the entire nation. The screen displayed a live feed from the Grand Chamber of the Congress, where a pivotal decision was about to be announced. Rows of solemn-looking congressmen sat in silence, having already cast their votes on a matter of great significance. A man at the podium, his voice steady and authoritative, declared the results: 325 votes in favor, with none opposing or abstaining. With an air of finality, he announced the enforcement of a new law, something called the deprivation of the mask. This figure, none other than the president of the parliament, directed his next words at one individual, the once revered hero, known as Mask. He laid out a damning case, citing overwhelming evidence that Mask had been responsible for the deaths of civilians and had attacked allied heroes from foreign nations, jeopardizing diplomatic ties. Without hesitation, the Congress collectively decreed the ultimate punishment. Mask was sentenced to death. However, considering his past heroics in defending humanity from monstrous and alien threats, the sentence was mitigated, but severe consequences remained. His prestigious titles, Supreme Leader of the Commonwealth and Supreme Marshal, were stripped away, leaving him with only the designation of a special hero. Under this ruling, he would still be obligated to serve when called upon, ensuring his continued presence in future crises. The news spread like wildfire, broadcasted across every screen in the city, stirring intense public discourse. Some citizens vocally opposed the decision, recalling Mask's countless sacrifices and insisting that without him, humanity would have perished long ago. However, two young heroes stepped forward, arguing that Mask alone should not receive all the credit for past victories. Their heated debate quickly escalated, drawing the attention of the surrounding crowd. The man defending Mask refused to back down, determined to prove his point with unwavering conviction. His resentment toward Mask ran deep. He despised the hero's arrogance and his tendency to view other heroes as opportunists who abuse their powers for personal gain. Deep down, this man was certain that every accusation against Mask was fabricated. Yet the heated debate was cut short as all eyes turned back to the ongoing broadcast. The parliament president formally dismissed Mask, granting him the status of a special hero while assuring him that his legacy as humanity's savior would never be forgotten. Mask remained silent throughout, his expression unreadable. He fixed his gaze on the president, his eyes void of any emotion. Then he slowly turned his attention toward the gathered congressmen, sensing something off. A creeping unease filled him. He was certain he had died during his final battle against the Lord of the Weaving Night. Yet here he was, standing on this platform, alive and bound by their judgment. The realization hit him like a cold wave. This wasn't a dream but a moment from his past, the exact point where betrayal would strike. As his mind wrestled with these thoughts, a sudden notification materialized before his eyes. It was from the system, confirming that Mask had successfully completed his mission of uniting humanity under a new national alliance. Now, he was presented with two distinct choices for his next path. The first choice was labeled Hero's Path. A new crisis loomed, and despite humanity's flaws, he would continue protecting them from the shadows. The second choice, Monster's Path, offered a different fate. He would still shield the world from threats, but as a creature of darkness, unbound by morality or human gratitude. A countdown appeared. He had precisely 20 minutes before the system would force him into an F-level environment. The weight of the decision loomed over him. Humanity's greatest hero now stood at an irreversible crossroads. But in the end, the choice wasn't difficult at all. Without hesitation, he selected the Monster's Path. Before anyone could react, Alvin interrupted the moment, questioning Mask's silence and wondering if he was dissatisfied with the verdict. Despite acknowledging Mask's contributions, Alvin, as a leader, was bound by duty. Mask's actions had repeatedly disrupted political stability. To regain international trust, the Congress had systematically twisted public perception over the years, molding Mask into the perfect scapegoat. Redirecting public resentment toward Mask allowed the Congress to restore its own image and tighten its grip on power. Soon Mask would be nothing more than a relic of the past, and the people would once again place their faith in the ruling government. This political maneuver also granted corrupt officials unchecked authority. Anyone who opposed them would be swiftly eliminated. But before they could celebrate their victory, Mask finally spoke, his voice cutting through the chamber. He had an objection. The entire assembly erupted into chaos, voices clashing in a storm of disbelief and outrage. Dao, however, remained composed. He had anticipated this reaction. knowing it would paint Mask as a power-hungry figure unwilling to relinquish influence, just like the relentless critic who had been bad-mouthing him throughout the hearing, twisting every word to fit a narrative. But then, Mask's voice cut through the uproar, making his plea heard. To everyone's shock, he announced his decision to relinquish even his title as a special hero. A heavy silence fell over the room. No one had expected this. Even Dao, despite his careful planning, found himself momentarily stunned. Mask rose from his seat, his voice unwavering as he repeated his declaration. He was done being a hero. He looked out at the sea of faces and simply stated that he was exhausted, that the burden of heroism had drained him completely. A furious voice interrupted. Someone accused him of rejecting their judgment out of spite, framing his decision as an act of vengeance. But Maska remained calm, shaking his head as he denied any bitterness toward the verdict. In fact, he revealed that he was relieved by it. This revelation blindsided his opposition. Dao had been certain that Mask would resist, that he could still be manipulated into serving their agenda. He had assumed Mask's strength and defiance were merely tools for undermining the Congress. Desperation crept into his voice as he insisted that Mask couldn't simply walk away. Then, seizing the moment, he pushed further, declaring that if Maska was truly resigning as a hero, then he must surrender his powers as well. Murmurs of unease spread through the crowd. Many struggled to make sense of this unexpected demand. Some even began to question whether this was a fair request or a blatant overreach. After all, Mask wasn't just any hero. He was a rank 13 warrior, standing leagues above the rest. The next strongest, Yao, was merely rank 9. Mask alone had managed to break past the fabled 10th level realm. Many in the hero community considered such an achievement impossible, a feat no one else could hope to replicate. Yet Dao continued his tirade, spinning a damning speech meant to turn public sentiment against Mask. He argued that after all the resources spent on him, Mask had no right to walk away. If he was truly determined to leave, then he had to relinquish the power that had made him a hero in the first place. In response, Mask closed his eyes briefly, then his aura surged, an overwhelming force shaking the chamber. The sheer intensity of his presence left Dao speechless, stealing the words from his lips. The same stunned silence spread among the congressmen and the countless citizens watching the broadcast. And then, to their shock, Mask simply nodded. He accepted Yao's condition. Mask slowly raised his hand, his fingertips crackling with raw energy. The moment had come. He was about to relinquish the power that once made him invincible. The corrupt officials who had demanded this now found themselves suffocating under the weight of his presence. Yet Mask remained calm, steadily channeling his immense energy into the air. The sheer force of it was too much. Several people in the chamber collapsed, unable to endure it. Their bodies trembled as they succumbed, gasping for breath. Even Yao, the rank 9 hero, felt his knees buckle under the overwhelming aura. He had to summon every ounce of his strength just to remain standing. The pressure was so intense that one by one, those present found themselves forced to their knees. And yet, Maska continued. If they wanted his power so badly, he would make sure they received it all. A blinding beam of light erupted from his hands, soaring into the sky like a divine judgment. Everything caught in its path was obliterated, leaving behind smoldering ruin. Those outside the building witnessed the spectacle, staring in awe and terror at the celestial force illuminating the heavens. Rumors spread instantly. Many believed a king-class monster had descended upon their city. But unlike before, this radiant force, once a beacon of hope for humanity, now carried a much darker message. The betrayal of a hero had been sealed in history once more, a lesson never learned. At last the energy dissipated and Mask stood motionless, his power, his legacy, now stripped away. Yao exhaled sharply, astonished that he had survived the ordeal. But his shock soon twisted into a smirk of satisfaction. He finally had what he wanted. Mask was now nothing more than an ordinary human. The greatest savior of mankind had been reduced to insignificance. Without a word, Mask turned and walked away. As he did, he reached for his mask, removing it for the first time in years. With that simple act, he cast aside the burdens of heroism, leaving them behind forever. Yet Yao remained rooted in place, unease creeping into his mind. He knew that Mask's departure marked the beginning of something far worse. Just then, the ground beneath Mask glowed with an eerie crimson light. In the blink of an eye, his figure vanished. He had been transported. Chao's eyes widened in disbelief, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just unfolded. A flood of system notifications appeared. Mask had been sent to a level 4 secret realm. The system's notification confirmed it. He had been transported into a mother spider hatching nest. Somewhere within the secret realm, eerie clicking sounds echoed through the dimly lit tunnels. Meanwhile, a group of heroes emerged from the entrance, gearing up for a dungeon raid. Their leader turned to his team, warning them that they would be facing level 3 spider guards, monstrous creatures the size of adult humans. A young woman reassured the team's healer, urging her not to let fear get the best of her. The others laughed, brushing off the warning as they eagerly prepared for battle. One of them sighed. disappointed that they would miss the live broadcast of Mask's trial. The woman pointed out that if not for the trial, they wouldn't have had this rare opportunity. Normally, higher-ranked heroes would have already claimed this dungeon. Their leader nodded before raising his weapon. "All right, it's time to clear this place," he declared, leading his team forward. But just as they were about to step inside, the portal behind them pulsed with a bright, unnatural glow. Startled, they turned around, expecting another team to emerge. Instead, a lone figure stepped through the shimmering gateway. The heroes immediately sensed that something was off. This man had entered a dangerous dungeon without any visible armor or weapons. Mask stood before them, scanning his unfamiliar surroundings. How long had it been since he last entered a low-tier dungeon like this? Memories flickered in his mind, reminding him of his early days as a hero. Back then, one of his first dungeons had been a time-limited trial where he had faced a demon god as the final boss. But things were different now. Mask was no longer a powerhouse. He had been reset to a mere level 1 human, and yet the system had thrown him into this place. He wasn't entirely sure if choosing the monster's path had been the right decision. But deep down, he was excited to see what kind of future awaited him. Now that he had to save the world as something other than a hero, the leader of the raid party approached, eyeing Mask with curiosity. "Are you here to clear the dungeon too?" His gaze flickered over Mask's empty hands. "Where's your weapon?" Mask simply raised a fist and smirked. "This is all I need." The leader's eyes lit up with interest. "A martial artist, huh? Not bad. That's a class built for pure combat." He nodded approvingly. One of the party members, R, checked Mask's stats and was stunned. "You're just level 1? The entire team froze in disbelief. No one at such a low level had any business being in a high-tier secret realm. Their leader narrowed his eyes and took a step closer to Mask. "Are you trying to get yourself killed in here?" he asked, his tone filled with both concern and irritation. Mask simply shrugged. "I'm here to clear the dungeon." A wave of laughter and skepticism rippled through the group. A level 1 with no gear against a level 3 secret realm? Impossible. Mask raised a hand dismissively. "Relax, I won't be getting in your way." The leader studied him carefully, committing his words to memory. Turning to R and C, he smirked. "Even if this guy begs for help, we're not lifting a finger." With that, the team finally focused on their mission and moved forward into the dungeon. As they disappeared into the shadows, one of the female members cast one last glance at Mask before following her team. The moment they entered, the battle began. A woman in the party unleashed a torrent of flames, incinerating the approaching spider monsters. An archer perched at the back, loosing precise shots to provide cover for his teammates. Their leader and the frontline warrior engaged the creatures head-on, their weapons clashing against monstrous limbs. Each movement was precise, honed through countless battles. Meanwhile, Mask stood off to the side, silently observing the battle unfold. A soft voice called out to him. One of the team members had approached. "Our leader isn't a bad guy," she said. "He's just worried. This place is no joke." She folded her arms. "If you're not careful, you won't last long." Mask smirked, watching the synchronized efforts of the team. "Heroes have come a long way," he mused. "It's good to see this level of coordination. Back then, things weren't this smooth. The road here was paved with blood and sacrifice." The woman raised an eyebrow. "You talk like an old man. You sound like one of those stubborn politicians in Congress." She wasn't wrong. Mask had personally enforced the very policies that encouraged teamwork among heroes, drastically reducing dungeon mortality rates. After a pause, she smiled and extended a hand. "I'm Yanshishi, level 2 healer. Nice to meet you." Mask hesitated before shaking her hand. Mask. But then he corrected himself. "Actually, my real name is Q. I haven't chosen a class yet. From here on out, just call me Q." Q hesitated. "I'm still thinking about it." After all, every existing class today had been created based on his designs. Shishi studied him for a moment before suggesting, "Your physique doesn't seem suited for the usual frontline combat classes. You should consider a spellcasting class. It'll keep you out of danger." She then chuckled nervously. "Sorry, I've been talking too much." But before she could say more, a sharp glint appeared behind her. Something was coming. Without thinking, Q grabbed her and yanked her away. A deadly attack landed right where she had just been standing. "Shadow Spider!" the archer shouted, eyes widening. Shishi gasped, realizing how close she had been to death. Q had saved her in an instant. But Q wasn't done. In one swift motion, he reached out and grabbed one of the spider's legs. With his bare hands, with sheer force, he ripped it clean off. And then, in one fluid motion, he wielded the severed leg like a weapon and impaled the spider with its own limb. The creature let out a horrifying screech before collapsing, dead. Silence filled the battlefield. The party members stood frozen, struggling to process what they had just witnessed. That was insane," one of them muttered. "Even martial artists don't pull off something like that." Q casually dusted himself off and turned to Shishi. "You can let go now. The danger's gone." Only then did Shishi realize she had been clinging to him the whole time. Face turning red, she quickly stepped back, stammering an apology. Meanwhile, Q noticed something strange. Defeating the shadow spider had given him 500 experience points. That meant his leveling system wasn't restricted by the usual penalties. He could gain experience at a normal rate, even from higher-level monsters. A smirk tugged at his lips. With this and his vast battle experience from his days as the greatest hero, regaining his former strength would be easier than he thought. The party leader finally broke the silence, stepping forward with an impressed nod. I don't know who you are, but you've got real talent. You might actually belong in this secret realm after all. He also expressed his gratitude to Q for stepping in and saving his comrade, ensuring that Q would earn a fair share of the rewards upon completing this realm. The MC simply responded that it was done out of principle, not for any reward. With that conversation behind them, the team pressed forward on their mission. They swiftly eradicated the lurking shadow spiders with coordinated precision. Their leader signaled that the boss was likely just around the next bend. He reminded everyone that this was their final battle before returning to reality, and reiterated their standard strategy. He would hold aggro while the others focused on dealing damage. He also gave a special reminder to the mage, urging her to use her fire abilities to burn away the spider silk. Meanwhile, the archer was eager to finish the mission quickly, hoping to catch the latest episode of The Trial of Mest. Another teammate chimed in, predicting that Mask would probably be found guilty. Their curiosity shifted toward Mask's true identity, as no one had ever seen his face beneath that infamous mask. One of the team members, who had once been a devoted fan of Mask, admitted that her perception changed after hearing the rumor that he had wiped out the entire city of Tula. Shishi, however, stood by Mask and spoke up in his defense. She argued that Mask had no choice but to act, as every inhabitant of Tula had fallen victim to a demonic infection, leaving him with no alternative. One of the guys teased her, accusing her of still being overly loyal to Mask's heroic image. Their leader, sensing that the discussion was getting out of hand, ordered them to drop the topic. He suspected that Q might be growing annoyed with their chatter. With that, the team shifted their focus back to the mission at hand. As they ventured deeper, they noticed an increasing number of spider webs filling their surroundings. However, instead of fear, excitement filled them as they anticipated the reward awaiting them after slaying the boss. Just then, a shadowy figure stirred, signaling an impending confrontation. The team immediately snapped to attention, their instincts honed for battle. Before them, a massive spider emerged, its many eyes gleaming with malice. Wasting no time, the leader charged forward, drawing the boss's attention to himself, as planned. He skillfully maintained aggro, ensuring the monster's focus remained locked on him. Meanwhile, his teammates unleashed their full arsenal of attacks. Tsu nimbly evaded every strike, recognizing that creatures in the lower realms lacked intelligence. This realization reaffirmed his belief that strategy would be the key to victory. With their combined strength, they knew these monsters could be taken down effortlessly. They relentlessly unleashed a barrage of attacks, refusing to give the creature any chance to recover. Shishi focused on healing, ensuring their leader remained in fighting condition as he absorbed the enemy's blows. Before long, their teamwork paid off, and the monster collapsed, lifeless. Their leader felt a surge of pride. Clearing a level 3 secret realm without sustaining serious injuries was an impressive feat. He reassured the team that the rewards would be fairly distributed, with Q receiving his rightful share. However, R and C exchanged uneasy glances. The system had informed them they would be transported to a level 4 secret realm, which contradicted their leader's statement. Something was off. Their unease deepened when another teammate pointed out the glaring absence of a treasure chest near the defeated boss. A chilling sensation crept through the tunnel ahead, an ominous aura making their instincts scream danger. Then, emerging from the shadows, they spotted a girl in a school uniform walking towards them. One of the team members narrowed her eyes, noticing an unusual detail about the girl. She was wearing an astronaut helmet, its visor reflecting their startled faces. Realization struck them like a thunderbolt. The reason no treasure chest had appeared was because the massive spider wasn't the true boss. This girl was. One of the fighters stepped forward, dismissing his concern. The pressure radiating from her felt weaker than that of the spider. Surely, she wouldn't be a serious threat. However, there was something unsettling about the way she moved. Her steps were unsteady, almost erratic. Then, without warning, she lunged forward in a frenzied sprint, closing the distance between them with alarming speed. The confident warrior met her charge head-on, fully expecting to dodge her attack with ease. Yet, instead of evading, the girl took his blow head-on without hesitation. His strike landed cleanly, just as he intended. The rest of the team watched the encounter with an eerie calm, expecting an effortless victory. The warrior even chuckled, boasting that this fight was nothing compared to the spider. He readied his spear for a finishing strike, his previous attack having left a gaping hole in the girl's torso. But then, to his horror, silky white threads poured out of the wound, lashing toward him. Before he could react, the webbing coiled around his arms, binding him in an unbreakable grip. He struggled desperately, trying to rip free, but the threads held firm like iron chains. A sharp, sickening crack echoed through the tunnel. His arms had been snapped in an instant. Panic erupted among the team, realization sinking in that they had vastly underestimated this foe. The leader quickly realized that physical attacks were useless against the monster's webs, so he commanded the mage to unleash her flames. Without hesitation, she began chanting her spell, sending a blazing inferno straight at the monstrous girl. Meanwhile, the archer rushed to rescue their ensnared teammate, worried that he might also get caught in the spreading fire. However, before he could even get close, the flames surged higher, fueled by an unseen force. Then, to their horror, multiple legs emerged from within the fire. The girl had undergone another transformation, her humanoid form now twisted with additional spider-like limbs. A wave of dread washed over the team. This was unlike anything they had ever encountered. One of them let out a terrified scream, only to be silenced as a clawed foot slammed into his chest. It was a direct attack from the monstrous boss. The archer, filled with rage, readied himself to strike back and avenge his fallen comrade. But before he could charge, Q swiftly intervened, warning him that rushing in recklessly would only lead to his demise. Their leader hesitated, taken aback by Q's certainty. "What do you mean?" he demanded. Q grimly explained that this monster's strength far exceeded their own. Their only chance was to hold it off until the portal reopened, but that wouldn't happen for another 3 hours. The weight of reality sank in. They couldn't possibly last that long. As if sensing their despair, the monster launched its next move. Once again, it shot out its sinister webbing, this time ensnaring the leader's arms before he could react. The archer attempted to assist, firing a barrage of arrows, but they bounced off uselessly. The monster took advantage of the distraction, lashing out and capturing the archer as well. Without mercy, it dragged him closer, revealing rows of razor-sharp fangs glistening with anticipation. The archer thrashed, desperately trying to escape. But within seconds, he was gone, consumed as an early meal. The gruesome sight sent a surge of fury through their leader's veins. Clenching his weapon tightly, he gathered all his remaining strength, bringing his blade down in a powerful slash to sever the monster's webs. But to his horror, his blade halted mid-swing, failing to cut through. This level 4 monster was simply too powerful. His strikes, once deadly, now felt as insignificant as a light breeze. The creature wasted no time, snaring his hands once more with its unbreakable webs. Helpless, he was now the one being dragged toward its gaping maw. Just then, Q's voice rang out. "Throw me your sword!" He urged the leader to trust him. If he wanted to survive, he needed to let Q take his hand. Realizing he had no better option, the leader made his choice. With a desperate motion, he flung his sword toward Q. Without hesitation, R and C made a brutal decision. They severed the leader's ensnared arm, knowing it was the only way to free him. The old warrior staggered back, saved from the monster's grip, but at a terrible cost. His agonized scream echoed through the cavern. In the next moment, Q grabbed him, pulling him away to safety before the beast could attack again. Shishi rushed forward, using her healing skills to stop the bleeding and ease his pain. Meanwhile, another teammate stood frozen in terror, before abruptly turning and sprinting away, choosing cowardice over battle. Shishi, confused, turned to Q. "Why aren't you running too?" she asked. R and C answered instead, their voices grim. "That monster is letting her go on purpose. It enjoys its prey's fear. The more terrified she gets, the tastier she becomes." Q nodded and explained further. "These creatures are called God's chosen beasts. They don't just feed on flesh. They consume human emotions like fear, jealousy, and resentment. They're not ordinary monsters," he continued. "They've been blessed by the outer gods, making them far more dangerous than anything else in this realm." R and C knew this all too well. In his past life, he had slain hundreds of them, but never had he expected to encounter one here, in this supposedly lower-ranked realm. The monster then began another horrifying tactic. It exhaled a thick, toxic gas, filling the cavern with a deadly miasma. Fortunately, Shishi was prepared. She activated a special skill, creating a barrier that repelled the poison before it could harm them. However, the fleeing woman wasn't so lucky. She was now gasping for air, her escape turning into a slow, agonizing struggle for survival. She had run too far, outside the range of Shishi's protective skill, and the poison invaded her lungs. Within moments, she collapsed, unconscious. Meanwhile, Shichi herself was struggling. The overwhelming toxicity of the gas was too much for a mere level 2 healer to endure. The monster let out an eerie, delighted chitter, sensing its prey weakening. But then it froze. Q was gone. He had vanished from his previous position. His voice echoed through the cavern. "Even if my powers were stripped away, my soul and spirit remain at level." That alone allowed him to resist the deadly poison effortlessly. R and C, having fought alongside Q in this realm, had also gained resistance through his presence. Q activated his hidden skill, and in an instant, his body began to transform. R and C followed suit, shifting into their monstrous new forms. And Q smirked at the enemy. "You should be honored," he taunted. "You'll be the first to witness my reborn strength." The monster, unfazed, retaliated by releasing a concentrated cloud of even more lethal poison directly at Q. But Q had already repositioned himself, closing in on the beast before it could even realize what was happening. In the blink of an eye, he vanished once again. The monster barely had a second to react before pain tore through its body. Q had already landed a devastating blow. R&C had severed one of its many legs in the process. Q picked up the dismembered limb, inspecting it with amusement. Not bad, he joked. These legs are pretty sturdy. The monster thrashed, trying to launch a counterattack. But it was useless. The power gap between them was insurmountable. Q sighed in disappointment. I expected more from a god's chosen beast, he muttered. But there was no time to waste. He decided to end this swiftly. R&C unleashed another relentless assault, each strike pushing the monster further into despair. Soon it was completely overwhelmed, its once terrifying form now battered and broken. It was left teetering, with only a single remaining leg to support itself. R&C took the opportunity to mock the beast, grinning at its pitiful state. The monster realized, too late, that it was hopelessly outmatched. In a final act of desperation, it turned and attempted to flee, its instinct for survival taking over. But then its other leg was severed once more, leaving it writhing in agony. The monster collapsed, its form twisting into something more grotesque, almost like a grotesque octopus. Desperate to flee, it dragged itself forward, but Q swiftly intervened. This abomination was now the ultimate predator, capable of consuming all others of its kind. And with that, R&C brought the battle to an end, their final strike decisive. The system promptly announced his victory, rewarding him with an unusual prize, a spider's foot. Without delay, he was enveloped in light, signaling his return to reality. 2 hours passed since the tumultuous battle concluded. Shishi roamed the streets, her thoughts tangled in the bizarre events she had just survived. When they regained consciousness, they found themselves outside the secret realm. The leader rushed to a hospital while the other woman escaped unscathed. Yet Shichi's concern was for Q, who had vanished without a trace. Determined, she searched tirelessly for him, scanning every street and alley. At last, she spotted him standing before an unfamiliar building. As for C, he had been transported directly into the city, disoriented and alone. Now he wandered aimlessly, searching for a place to call home. However, even the cheapest rooms cost over 3,000 Union dollars per month, far beyond his means. Once, as a hero, he had everything provided for him. Now he had nothing, not even a single coin. As despair settled in, a familiar voice called out his name, Sishi. He turned and saw her approaching, her expression a mix of relief and excitement. He vaguely recognized her as the healer from the secret realm, but struggled to recall her name. Her smile faded for a moment, disappointed but not surprised, before she reintroduced herself. Yan Shishi, she said, a touch of amusement returning to her voice. Despite everything, she was simply happy to see him alive and unharmed. She quickly noticed that Q had been fixated on the rental listings outside the building. From his reaction, she deduced that he had nowhere to stay and no family to rely on. Wanting to distract him, Shichi began recounting the history of Da City, a place rebuilt after the Great Disaster 40 years ago. With rapid urbanization, the area had transformed from ruins into a thriving metropolis. As they spoke, Shishi impulsively offered to show Q her home. Without hesitation, she welcomed him in, deciding then and there that she would take him in like a stray cat. Her house had plenty of space, after all. Q's eyes landed on an object near the gate, a metal plaque. Shishi explained that it was an award her father had received upon retiring as a hero. Her father had been a level 5 combatant, a seasoned warrior who had participated in countless battles. Shichi proudly mentioned that he had once fought alongside Mask, though she admitted she wasn't entirely sure if it was true. After all, her father only shared that story when he had been drinking. Q grew curious and asked more about her father, only to learn that he had already passed away. Though his battle wounds had healed, the toll of war had drained his vitality, and he did not live long after retirement. R&C then inquired about her mother, only to hear that she had died giving birth to Shixi's younger sister. A silence hung between them as Q struggled to find the right words, but Shichi smiled, assuring him that there was no need to feel sorry. It had all happened long ago and she had moved on. With a welcoming gesture, she invited Q inside. She even promised to lend him some clothes until he could get his own. Leading him through the house, she pointed to a spare room, offering it to him as his personal space. Q stood in the doorway, reflecting on how different this was from his past life on the battlefield. A peaceful life seemed better. He resolved to repay Shixi's kindness once he started earning from the secret rounds. Just then, an unexpected visitor arrived. A girl in a wheelchair rolled into view, her sharp gaze locking onto Q. "Who is this?" she demanded. Her name was Kai Enli, Shishi's younger sister, and she wasted no time expressing her skepticism. She didn't like the idea of her older sister bringing a complete stranger into their home. Without another word, she turned her wheelchair and left abruptly. Shishi sighed and apologized to Q, explaining that her sister was wary of unfamiliar people. To make matters worse, today was a particularly sensitive day. The trial of Mask was taking place, and Kai Enli was one of his most devoted fans. Q had never expected that he once had such passionate supporters. Meanwhile, back in her room, Kai Enli sat in front of her computer, her expression tense. She was completely absorbed in her screen, furiously typing rebuttals against the online critics of Mask. With each click of her keyboard, she fired back at the trolls, defending her fallen hero. Just as she was about to post another argument, Shishi's voice rang out, calling them to dinner. But Kai Enli was too engrossed in her online battle to care. She refused to eat, even with a guest in the house. She bluntly told her sister that there was no need to treat Q like family. Shishi sighed in defeat, realizing there was no convincing her stubborn sister. Turning back to Q, she awkwardly apologized, saying that their meal was rather simple. However, to Q, this food was more than enough. It was a feast compared to what he was used to. Memories surfaced of the times he had been forced to consume unseasoned monster meat, the taste barely tolerable. Back then, he had been driven by duty, willing to suffer any hardship if it meant protecting humanity. As they ate, the television broadcast interrupted their meal with breaking news about Mask's trial. The two news anchors debated the latest developments in the courtroom. One of them discussed an online theory claiming that Mask had faked relinquishing his powers and simply vanished after the trial. The other anchor was more focused on the real problem, the loss of humanity's greatest hero and what it meant for the future. A third panelist, clearly biased against Mask, dismissed all concerns, insisting that mankind would survive any disaster without him. He firmly stated that the world would continue moving forward, with or without its fallen hero. Shikshi frowned, still deeply concerned about the outcome of Mask's trial. She turned to Q, curious about his thoughts on the matter, but she paused mid-question when she noticed he was already on his fourth bowl of rice. Completely absorbed in his meal, Q was more interested in eating than discussing the trial. Undeterred, Shichi continued sharing her own opinions, convinced that Mask must have had a deeper reason for his actions. Q gave a vague, half-hearted response, making it obvious he didn't care much about the discussion. If only she knew the truth, that he was Mask himself. She chuckled at the thought of what her sister would do if she saw this news. Knowing her, she'd probably smash the TV in frustration. Just then, loud voices echoed from outside, shattering the moment. A group of men introduced themselves as representatives of Kaigi Yang Investment Company, their tone aggressive. They banged on the door repeatedly, even threatening to burn the house down if no one answered. Alarmed, Shishi rushed to the entrance, her heart pounding. The moment she opened the door, the men greeted her with smug, menacing grins. She firmly reiterated that she had no intention of selling the house to their company, no matter what. But the man smirked and pointed out her current predicament. She had lost her entire party in the secret realm and was now without any income. Shi's eyes narrowed. How did these men know what had happened inside the secret realm? The thug casually revealed that their company had government connections, making it easy to gather such information. Confidently, he told Shishi that sooner or later, she would have no choice but to accept their offer. He gave her 5 days to reconsider, warning that if she refused, things would get much worse for her. With a smug grin, he placed an offer of 100,000 federal dollars on the table, expecting her to take it. Shishi was baffled. Last time, they had offered 3 million. Even though she never intended to sell, the drastic price drop made no sense. The man clearly saw her hesitation and pressed harder, trying to force a decision on the spot. He even brought up her sister's expensive medical treatments, reminding Shishi that Kai Enli's condition required constant care and that she had barely 30,000 left in her bank account. Just then, Q stepped forward, making his presence known. The thug turned his attention to Q and, with an amused smirk, assumed he was Jitshi's boyfriend. Extending his hand, he offered Q a handshake. Introducing himself in a self-important tone, he declared, "The name's Jin Kenzo, chief of the security department." Q, out of politeness, moved to accept the handshake. However, before their hands could touch, Sishi's eyes widened in alarm. She quickly warned Q about Kenzo's abilities, but it was already too late. Kenzo specialized in mental attacks, and he was about to strike. Without hesitation, he unleashed his power on Q, expecting to overwhelm him instantly. As he infiltrated Q's mind, Kenzo prepared to launch a devastating mental assault. Initially, he only intended to give Q a mild concussion, as he was feeling generous today. However, the moment he attempted to dig deeper, he froze. Something was wrong. He had been trying to locate Q's consciousness, yet it felt like he was wandering aimlessly. Only then did he realize the terrifying truth. This vast and endless expanse was Q's mental world. Panic set in. Never before had he encountered a mind this powerful. Kenzo's instincts screamed at him. He had to escape, and fast. But before he could retreat, a massive tidal wave formed within Q's mental world, blocking his escape. The sheer force of the waves engulfed him, dragging him deeper into Q's consciousness. In that moment, Kenzo realized Q was operating on an entirely different level. The overwhelming mental energy threatened to consume him whole, rendering him completely powerless. Yet Q himself remained passive. He didn't even need to lift a finger. Kenzo, submerged in Q's mind, could see the abyss surrounding him, a void of endless power. He let out a terrified scream, realizing he had just witnessed the presence of a true monster. Back in the real world, Kenzo's body went limp, collapsing unconscious in an instant. Chichi gasped in confusion, completely unaware of what had just happened. The remaining bodyguards instinctively reached for their weapons, preparing to attack Q in retaliation. However, the second-in-command quickly stepped forward, signaling them to stand down. Unlike the others, this man could tell that Q was someone far beyond their league. Analyzing the situation, he estimated that Q was at least a level 3 professional, perhaps even higher. As he helped lift Kenzo's unconscious body, he turned to Shishi with a cold glare. "This isn't over," he warned. Despite being the ones who instigated the situation, they still had the audacity to threaten retaliation if anyone dared to stand against them. Once the thugs had finally left, Shishi turned to Q, her face full of curiosity and disbelief. "Did you really do that to Kenzo?" she asked. Q shrugged. "He brought it on himself. I never intended to do anything. It was his mistake trying to invade my mind." It was then that Q learned the truth. Keigi Company had been harassing Shishi and her family for the past 4 years. Even though Shichi had repeatedly refused to sell the house, they continued their intimidation tactics, even going so far as to threaten her younger sister. The only reason their harassment had temporarily stopped was because Shichi's former leader had intervened. But now, with her leader hospitalized, she feared they would soon return, more aggressive than ever. Q frowned and asked about the government benefits that should have been provided to them. After all, he had personally pushed for such policies when he was still a hero. Shishi bitterly revealed that her family had never received any of those benefits. It turned out that the government was secretly working with corporate giants like Kaigi Yang, allowing them to exploit the system. For the first time, Q realized that the policies he had fought for as a hero were being ignored, twisted, or outright discarded. After the tension settled, Q quietly joined Shichi in washing the dishes, wanting to offer at least some help. Though it was a small act, it was the only way he could contribute for now. Shichi smiled at him. "You've already done more than enough," she said. "Thanks to you, those thugs won't bother us, at least for now." She then asked him about his upcoming strategies in the secret realms, and whether Q intended to collaborate with other factions. Meanwhile, Shichi found herself in a similar predicament. If her leader didn't regain consciousness soon, she would have no choice but to seek a new party. But in the current climate, switching parties carried significant risks, especially with betrayals becoming more frequent. Some groups went as far as turning against their own teammates for better rewards. Mask had already implemented strict policies against intraprofessional killings. Yet once inside the realms, anything could happen without oversight. She reassured Q that if she ever found a trustworthy team, she wouldn't hesitate to recommend him as a potential recruit. Q acknowledged her advice with a nod, but deep down, he understood that his chosen path as a monster-class professional made integration nearly impossible. He was also painfully aware that no rational person would willingly fight alongside someone labeled as an abomination. As he finished scrubbing the last dish, the system sent him another notification, cutting through his thoughts. It was another Level 4 Secret Realm mission, but this time the requirement was absolute. Q had to clear it alone within a 12-hour preparation window. Moments later, the familiar hum of energy filled the space around him. A shimmering portal materialized, signaling the gateway to his next challenge. Stepping through, Q emerged into an unfamiliar terrain, the isolated realm he was now tasked to conquer on his own. He silently appreciated his unique ability to bypass government bureaucracy and enter realms freely without needing official approval. His eyes scanned the environment. It bore a striking resemblance to the medieval landscapes of ancient Europe. Towering above him were massive gargoyle statues, their ominous presence hinting at hidden dangers. The moment his gaze met theirs, an unsettling sensation crawled up his spine. Faint cracks began to spiderweb across the statue's rigid surfaces, releasing eerie creaks. Within seconds, the stone exteriors crumbled away, revealing the monstrous forms of living scarlet gargoyles. Q instinctively shifted into an analytical mindset, breaking down their potential weaknesses. He imagined what would happen if Xerxes' team had been the ones to face these creatures. Their casualties would have been catastrophic. Wasting no time, the gargoyles launched themselves at Q with murderous intent. Yet their momentum was abruptly halted. Q had effortlessly caught them mid-charge with his bare hands. With a smirk, he allowed his monstrous form to take over once again, embracing his true nature. For the first time, he almost felt sorry for these creatures. They had no idea they were about to face something far worse than themselves. And just like that, 2 gargoyles were reduced to rubble within mere moments. Without hesitation, Q pressed forward, keen to uncover what other threats lurked in this forsaken realm. As he ventured deeper, another cluster of gargoyles came into view, waiting like silent sentinels. With a smirk, he taunted them, daring the entire swarm to attack him at once. The stone beasts spread their wings, ascending into the air. They quickly formed a tight circle around Q, trapping him in mid-battle. RNC assumed his usual superhero landing stance, but this time he planned something far more devastating. Instead of waiting for them to strike, Q propelled himself skyward in one swift motion. He clenched his fists, scanning the airborne enemies around him. Then methodically and with terrifying precision, he dismantled them one by one, each gargoyle crumbling under a single overwhelming blow. And soon after, our MC continued his relentless assault, ripping their wings apart as if peeling paper. Even these creatures of stone, devoid of flesh, began to experience something they never had before. Fear, pure and unfiltered, as they realized they were facing an opponent beyond their understanding. After he crushed the final gargoyle into dust, a new presence descended from the darkness above. It was the leader of these creatures, their true master. A towering figure known as the Lovestone statue now stood before him. Q took a moment to observe its humanoid form and scoffed. "It looks too much like a human," he muttered. "That just makes me want to destroy it even more." Without hesitation, both figures lunged at each other, their speed distorting the air between them. Then, nothing. The battlefield was consumed by an eerie, unnatural silence. Time passed, and soon the silence was broken by the sound of creaking doors. A squad of professionals entered, weapons drawn, ready for a confrontation. But instead of an enemy, all they found was a collapsed battlefield filled with rubble and an empty chamber. The team leader furrowed his brows, confused. According to their intel, they were the first to set foot inside this dungeon. The entrance had been sealed upon their arrival, making it impossible for anyone else to have gotten here before them. A female scout knelt beside a shattered gargoyle, carefully examining the remains. "Captain," she called out, her voice laced with unease, "whoever did this wasn't human." The wounds were jagged, uneven, not the clean cuts of a blade. These creatures had been torn apart by sheer force. Just the thought of someone using their bare hands to dismantle these monsters sent shivers down their spines. The notion of fighting such a being seemed less like a battle, and more like an impending nightmare. But then, something caught his eye, undeniable proof that this battle had truly taken place. A lifeless body was impaled against one of the room's stone pillars, frozen in its final moment. It was none other than the monster leader itself, its own spear now serving as the weapon of its demise. Meanwhile, at the Secret Realm Inspection Bureau office in Dodge City, tensions were running high. A flood of complaints had overwhelmed the department, leaving the officers scrambling for answers. Their boss was livid. So far, 7 different teams had reported that their assigned dungeons had already been mysteriously cleared before they arrived. This couldn't keep happening. Otherwise, it would appear as though they were failing to do their jobs properly. One officer, however, pointed out that clearing secret realms ahead of schedule wasn't necessarily a bad thing. The boss slammed his fist on the desk, frustrated that his subordinate was missing the bigger issue. Someone was bypassing security to enter these realms undetected, jeopardizing the safety of licensed professionals. If this rogue individual was simply hunting monsters, there would be no problem. But if their goal was to ambush and eliminate licensed professionals, it could send shockwaves through the entire hero community. Taking a deep breath, the boss leaned back and spoke gravely, recalling a dark truth from his past. "Back in my day," he muttered, "most deaths in the dungeon didn't come from monsters. They came from betrayal, teammates killing each other for power and profit." He began piecing together the puzzle, scrutinizing every report they had received. The first case involved a dungeon where gargoyles had been brutally dismantled. Based on the level of destruction, the infiltrator had to be at least a level 4 or 5 professional. They ruled out the possibility of multiple attackers as the pattern of monster kills was too consistent. It all pointed to a single individual. Given this information, the boss concluded that whoever was responsible would eventually try to sell their loot on the market. Without hesitation, he ordered his team to sweep the city's trade hubs, tracking down any suspicious sales of dungeon-exclusive items. Meanwhile, at the bustling professional trading market in Dar City, business was as lively as ever. One shopkeeper, in particular, was thrilled to have a valuable customer making a large sale. That customer was Q. He had just offloaded his loot, exchanging it for a respectable sum. He barely glanced at the earnings, indifferent to the amount, as selling loot was merely a side benefit of completing his quests. Money was never his priority, but with this income, he could finally assist Chichi and cover his overdue rent. As he tucked his earnings away, a familiar voice nearby caught his attention. Turning his head, he recognized the source immediately. It was Yishi. She was at the shop trying to sell an item of her own. The shopkeeper, with a sly grin, kept pushing Shishi to sell the antique sword for far less than it was worth, claiming its age had reduced it to mere scrap metal. This sword, once wielded by her father, was the last precious heirloom she had left, and hearing it be dismissed so easily only deepened her sorrow. Sensing her hesitation, the shopkeeper feigned generosity, slightly increasing his offer to $3,500, just a small jump from his initial $3,300 bid. Jishi stood frozen in thought, torn between her attachment to the sword and her desperate need to cover her sister's mounting medical expenses. The shopkeeper, however, was fully aware that Jishi was clueless about the weapon's real worth, and he was eager to take advantage of that ignorance. A sword of this caliber wasn't something commonly found. It came from high-level secret realms and could easily fetch $10,000 or more in the right market. He leaned in, pressing her harder, warning that if she didn't accept his offer now, he might just change his mind. Just as Hichi was about to give in, a voice cut through the tense moment. Q had stepped forward, his gaze locking onto the sword in Shishi's hands as he silently assessed its value. With just a glance, he recognized it as a level 5 professional-grade long blade, an exceptional weapon far beyond what a casual trader would deal in. Without hesitation, he told Shishi that he was interested in taking the weapon himself. The shopkeeper's face twisted in anger as he accused Q of interfering and stealing his deal at the last moment. Ignoring the outburst, Q calmly placed all the money he had earned from clearing dungeons into Shishi's hands. The sheer amount left both Shishi and the shopkeeper stunned, and realizing he couldn't match the offer, the shopkeeper backed down in defeat. Later, Q and Shishi found themselves sitting on a quiet park bench, where Q carefully examined the blade now in his possession. With a soft smile, Shishi offered to sell it to him for only $1,500, feeling guilty about accepting so much from him. But Q firmly rejected her offer, insisting that she take all the money as his way of repaying her for offering him shelter and home-cooked meals. He then revealed something that made her eyes widen. The sword wasn't just valuable, it was worth at least $10,000, possibly even more. Shishi chuckled, commenting that the sword seemed to suit him perfectly. Both of them carried far too many secrets. She had long suspected that Q was hiding something. His mysterious escape from their last secret realm, the sudden wealth he had accumulated. But she chose not to pry. More than anything, she simply hoped that Q would cherish and honor her father's sword as much as she did. "Its name is Flying Crow," she told him, watching his reaction as he ran his fingers over the blade's edge. Q nodded in approval, finding the name fitting. It evoked the image of a shadowy predator, lurking unseen before striking with deadly precision. Shishi shared the heartbreaking story of her younger sister, Kind Lu, who had been trapped in the city when the infamous Great Ghost incident occurred. This monstrous threat, a level 10 entity, had wreaked havoc across the area. The battle to defeat the Great Ghost was a costly one. Government forces, the military, and countless professionals had sacrificed their lives to put an end to its destruction. Shishi's father was among the fallen. In the aftermath, the only thing that was recovered from the battlefield was his treasured sword, Flying Crow. The devastation didn't stop there. The Great Ghost emitted deadly radiation, its sheer presence warping the environment so intensely that the sky had turned an eerie green on that fateful day. Kind Lu had been caught at the very edge of the radiation zone. Though she survived, the contamination had severely affected her legs. Before the incident, Kind Lu had been a prodigy with the sword, showing potential to become a level 5 swordsman or even higher. But after that day, everything changed. She required constant treatment from high-level healers just to stop the radiation from spreading further through her body. Shishi, once an aspiring close combat fighter herself, had been forced to abandon her dreams in favor of a more stable and survival-focused career. Q listened in silence, his mind flashing back to that very incident. He had been the one to take down the Great Ghost, with a single punch, but it arrived 10 hours too late. In that short time, lives had been shattered, families destroyed. Remembering it now, he felt his rage reignite. He despised monsters for the suffering they brought. He also recalled that Mask had struck a deal with the federal government, promising aid to the families affected by the catastrophe. Yet hearing Shishi's story, it was clear that promise had gone unfulfilled. Still, after sharing her burden with Q, Shishi felt a little lighter. She smiled and told him they should head home. She planned to cook him a delicious meal as thanks. And so the two set off toward home. As they walked, Q happened to pass by two men lurking near the marketplace, their eyes scanning the area. They were searching for loot from the infiltrated dungeons. They were certain that the stolen items would appear on the professional market soon. Meanwhile, in the House of Sexy, Kind Lu was locked in a battle of her own, fending off online trolls with sharp words and quick wit. But her focus was broken by a sudden aggressive pounding on the door. The force behind it told her immediately that it wasn't her sister. A sinking feeling hit her as she recalled the men from Kagi Young Investment Company. The knocks grew more insistent, each one heavier than the last. Her heart pounded as she glanced around the room until her eyes landed on a wooden stick. Without hesitation, she grabbed it, ready for whatever came next. Clutching the wooden stick tightly, she made her way toward the door. Just as she reached it, a powerful kick sent it flying open. A man strode into the house, exuding arrogance. "Nice place," he sneered, looking directly at Kind Lu. The smug greeting only fueled her anger. She swung her wooden stick at him with all her might. But he dodged effortlessly and she lost her balance. She hit the ground hard, gasping in frustration. The man stepped on her weapon, pinning it under his boot. He smirked, knowing full well that she was helpless against him. "Find Shishi," he barked at his men, "and that bastard who hurt Kenzo last time." The thugs immediately set to work, ransacking the house, overturning furniture, and breaking anything in their way. Minutes later, one of them reported back, "Boss, they're not here." The leader frowned, then his expression darkened. "Fine. We'll take the little cripple with us instead." "Can't go back empty-handed." One of the lackeys hesitated. "Boss, kidnapping? That's serious business. The cops." The boss chuckled and clapped the man on the back. "Smart thinking. That's why I have a better plan." He tossed him a set of truck keys. "Drive this baby into their yard when they get back." "Huh?" The thug looked at him, confused. "We'll dump a mountain of garbage on their place. Call it an accident. No crime in that, right?" The boss grinned. The room filled with laughter as they finalized their plan. Meanwhile, outside, rain had started to fall. Shichi and Q were sprinting back toward the house, their clothes soaked but their focus unwavering. And then Shishi saw it. Her sister, lying on the ground, soaked, shivering. "Kind Lu!" Yishi rushed forward, kneeling beside her. Gritting her teeth, Kin Lu told them everything. It was Kaijing Investment Company. Shishi's hands clenched into fists, anger boiling inside her. Q helped Kind Lu back inside, his expression unreadable. "Let's get her inside first." But before they could move, a thunderous crash shattered the air. The ground trembled as a truck rammed into their yard, its cargo spilling forward in an avalanche of filth. Garbage, rotten food, and debris now covered their home. Shishi stood her ground, her fists clenched. She already knew who was responsible for this. One of the thugs smirked. "What an unfortunate accident, huh?" he mocked. He gestured toward the pile of garbage. "Since you're already standing there, might as well start cleaning up." Kind Lu reached out to console her sister, but Q stopped her. His voice was calm but firm. "Let her be. It'll only hurt her more if you insist," Q said. Without a word, Shichi turned and walked into the house, her head held high. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Outside, only Q and Kind Lu remained, the rain pouring steadily around them. Lu's voice trembled. Why does this keep happening to us?" She looked at Q, eyes pleading. "Is there even justice in this world?" Aiku's expression remained cold. "There never was." Lu's lips quivered. "Then, is there at least a little fairness?" Q let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Even the rain falls equally on everyone." He unsheathed the sword and held it out under the rain. Droplets slid down the steel like silent tears. "It falls on those who suffer, and on those who are unjust." His grip tightened. His frustration was clear. Without a second thought, he took Ken Lu's wooden training sword and crushed it effortlessly in his hand. The sound of splintering wood broke something inside Lu, and she couldn't hold back her tears any longer. Q exhaled slowly. "Your family's problems are nothing compared to the chaos in this world. I don't have time to deal with small matters like these." He turned away, his voice dropping. "But trouble keeps following your sister, and I hate being inconvenienced." Lu wiped her tears, eyes widening. "Where are you going?" Q glanced over his shoulder. "To kill them." Panic surged through Lu. "You can't!" she cried. "The company has professionals, level 3 and 4 fighters. You won't stand a chance." She tried to reason with him. "You just said this was a minor problem. It's not worth it." Q smirked. "It is a minor problem." His fingers traced the hilt of his sword, his voice laced with amusement. "But I enjoy handling boring problems like this." He turned his gaze to the stormy sky, especially when the solution is violence. That afternoon, beneath the relentless rain, a storm far more dangerous was about to begin. Q stood motionless in front of the grand entrance, his fingers tightening around his weapon. He was moments away from unleashing chaos inside. The establishment radiated elegance, its golden chandeliers illuminating the lavish interior. Despite its beauty, an air of hostility lingered, with bodyguards stationed at every corner. Q stepped inside, his mere presence triggering an immediate security response. The guards didn't flinch. Their smirks hinted at a desire for confrontation. Two men in tailored suits strode forward, ordering Q to lower his weapon. However, R and C advanced undeterred, their eyes locked on their target. An eerie tension filled the room as if a silent battle had already begun. In the blink of an eye, a body crumpled to the floor, lifeless. The remains of two others disintegrated, vanishing into nothingness. A notification flashed in Q's vision, a new mission directive from the system. He was to wield Flying Crow and eliminate every hostile entity in sight. The reward, an evolution of his blade's power, making it deadlier than ever. Reinforcements poured into the room, their expressions hardened with resolve. A veteran among them gestured for caution, sensing the magnitude of Q's strength. The guards closed in, their strategy clear, overwhelm him with sheer numbers. They launched their assault with synchronized precision, moving as one deadly force. But before they could land a strike, R and C had already acted. One adversary lunged at Q, desperation fueling his reckless attack. Yet his aura betrayed his intent, revealing his next move before execution. Q's blade slashed through the air, severing his arms in a clean arc. As he attempted to finish him, the blade momentarily jammed. Flying Crow was losing its edge. The others spotted the flaw, realizing this was their chance to retaliate. Without hesitation, Q abandoned his sword and relied on raw strength. His unexpected shift caught them off guard. His fist struck harder than steel. With a final devastating blow, Q reclaimed his weapon from the fallen. He pressed on, methodically cutting down each opponent in his path. Meanwhile, in a distant office, a well-dressed man leaned back in his chair. Confident in his scheme, he sipped his drink, expecting the sisters to surrender their land soon. A panicked subordinate burst into the office, his face pale with fear. He stammered out the news. An unknown intruder had single-handedly wiped out most of their guards and was heading straight for them. The boss's mind raced. They had always been careful to avoid crossing powerful figures. So who had they unknowingly provoked? Without hesitation, he ordered his men to investigate the situation. The armed enforcers stormed out, gripping their weapons tightly, tension thick in the air. As they turned a corner, a horrifying sight met their eyes. A wounded man knelt on the stairs, pleading desperately for mercy. His cries were silenced by a swift, merciless black slash. From the shadows of the stairwell, Q emerged, his blade dripping with fresh blood. The boss tensed, immediately sensing an overwhelming aura radiating from RNC. Forcing himself to remain composed, he barked at his men, reminding them they were elite professionals who feared no one. The three strongest among them stepped forward, gripping their weapons with unwavering focus. As level 4 professionals, they believed they had the upper hand and offered Q a final chance to surrender. But one of them gasped in recognition. This was the man who had left Kenzo in a coma after the last encounter at his house. Q knew that against 3 seasoned fighters, relying on his human form alone would be a disadvantage. Without warning, RNC lashed out, shattering the light switches along the hallway. Darkness consumed the corridor, leaving only the sounds of shifting feet and hushed breathing. The men braced themselves, suspecting Q planned to hunt them in the shadows. But one of them smirked. Darkness meant nothing to him. Activating his night vision ability, he scanned the surroundings, ready to strike. As his eyes adjusted, he noticed something strange. Something was horribly wrong. The figure they had been facing moments ago had disappeared. In his place stood something monstrous, an entity that defied human nature. A dreadful chill spread through his body as an oppressive aura enveloped the space. He tried to react, but before he could move, Q's silhouette blurred. In an instant, Flying Crow sliced through him, consuming him entirely. The boss called out his name, but the only response was the thick, suffocating scent of blood. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. Was his strongest man already dead? Outside, a sudden bolt of lightning struck a nearby rooftop, illuminating the horror unfolding within. The sudden flash of lightning illuminated the carnage, revealing Q poised for his next strike. One of the remaining fighters managed to intercept his attack just in time. A split-second delay, and his head would have been rolling on the blood-soaked floor. The blonde warrior gritted his teeth and conjured his ice ability. With a flick of his wrist, he launched a razor-sharp ice arrow toward Q, but Q had already anticipated the attack before it was even released. RNC casually raised a single hand, effortlessly stopping the projectile midair. With a slight squeeze, the ice arrow shattered into glittering fragments. His glowing eyes then shifted toward the caster, marking him as the next target. A sickening squelch echoed through the room, blood sprayed, and a body collapsed. Q now held a severed head in his grasp, his expression unreadable. Their leader opened his mouth to speak, but words never left his lips. In the next instant, his head was separated from his body, rolling across the floor. The so-called greatest hero of humanity had undeniably embraced the path of a monster. Flying Crow dripped with fresh blood, its crimson sheen reflecting the terror around it. The reinforcements who had rushed in to defend their boss stood frozen. What once seemed like a straightforward battle had turned into their worst nightmare. None of them had ever expected to face a creature of this caliber. In a blink, Q's form vanished from their sight. Before they could react, he was already standing right in front of them. Moments later, silence filled the hall. Their bodies lay motionless. Q had dispatched them with terrifying efficiency. Just then, a voice cut through the eerie stillness, commanding Q to stop. RNC turned, instantly recognizing that this opponent was unlike the others. Standing before him was a level 6 professional, an elite among elites. The man studied Q carefully, initially assuming he was using a transformation spell. However, the demonic aura surrounding him proved otherwise, shattering that assumption. He descended the stairs slowly, his gaze locked onto Q with deadly intent. Declaring his plan to hunt Q down, he sought to balance the scales after today's massacre. Without warning, he vanished, his speed breaking past human limits. In a flash, he reappeared behind RNC, launching a precise strike. This professional was already impressed because Q managed to dodge his attack with perfect precision. He acknowledged Q's impressive reaction speed, noting it was beyond what he had encountered before. However, that first strike was merely a test to gauge Q's capabilities, not his true offensive intent. Now armed with the knowledge he sought, He launched a relentless barrage of attacks against Q. Every strike carried deadly intent, and despite Q's agility, a few slashes still landed. The professional found himself thrilled, realizing he was up against an opponent truly worth his skill. With a calculated step, he lunged at Q once more, aiming to end things quickly. RNC effortlessly sidestepped the attack, showing his complete control over the battlefield. But what seemed like a failed strike was actually a carefully laid trap. From the folds of his coat, the professional suddenly pulled out a concealed firearm. Without hesitation, he pulled the trigger, landing a direct and precise shot on Q. A smirk crossed his face. This technique had never failed to annihilate its targets. Every monster he had ever used this on had been obliterated without a trace. He was already calculating the monster's worth, convinced that he could still sell its remains for a high price. But as the smoke and dust cleared, Q stood tall, his head still perfectly intact. The professional's confidence wavered for the first time as disbelief crept into his expression. He found himself questioning how any monster could have possibly survived that direct attack. Q, unfazed, spoke with an eerie calm, naming the technique that had just been used against him, the 19 rapier style. He then offered rare praise, acknowledging the professional's mastery over the technique's intricacies. However, he revealed a shocking truth. This technique was his own creation, designed specifically for rapier users. Q explained that the 19 rapier style was never meant for destruction, but for justice. He accused the professional of misusing it, wielding it in service of greed rather than righteousness. The professional scoffed, dismissing Q's words as naive and irrelevant to his mission. To him, the suffering of others meant nothing. He believed the world would continue turning regardless of their fate. This cold pragmatism was the core of his twisted ideology, the principle that defined his every action. Still determined to eliminate Q, he resumed his assault, convinced that morality had no place in battle. But Q had seen enough. His decision was made, and he would no longer hold back. In an instant, grotesque, claw-like appendages sprouted from Q's back, signaling the true fight had just begun. Q's weapon lashed out with inhuman speed, yet the professional narrowly evaded it once again. But the next strike came too fast. Before he could react, it was already upon him. Taking full advantage of this opening, Q unleashed a relentless barrage of attacks toward the sky. As the echoes of the onslaught faded, the battlefield bore witness to its aftermath. The professional, bloodied and exhausted, asked Q one final question. What kind of monster was he? With unwavering resolve, RNC gripped his sword once more and prepared to give his answer. He reminded the man that Q's identity had been made clear long before this moment, and with that, the feared weapon known as Flying Crow was once again soaked in crimson. Q felt a shift in the air, an eerie hum resonating from his weapon. In an instant, Flying Crow transformed, shedding its former self to become Bloodraven. The true nature of this weapon revealed itself. It possessed limitless potential for evolution. Though its outward appearance remained the same, Q sensed a profound shift in its essence. It was as if the weapon itself now had a heartbeat, pulsating with newfound energy. In that moment, Q realized that Bloodraven was the perfect reflection of himself, ever growing, ever adapting. But before he could revel in this revelation, his gaze locked onto another figure. This man, a bystander to the carnage, stood paralyzed with fear, his body trembling uncontrollably. Desperation filled his eyes as he fell to his knees, begging Q to spare his life. But Q was no longer bound by the ideals of a hero. His morals had shifted into something far darker. With cold indifference, he decided to offer this man as the first feast for his newly awakened weapon. Bloodraven gleamed ominously as Q swung, its edge singing through the air. The sheer force of the slash not only obliterated the man, but carved destruction into the very walls around them. The devastating impact even reached beyond the building, sending shockwaves into the outside world. Meanwhile, as chaos reigned within, an elite task force had already taken position outside. One officer relayed through his radio that the perimeter was secure, reporting that an anonymous tip had led them here. The commanding officer ordered his team to hold fire. Engagement would only occur if negotiations failed. Despite knowing that those slain inside were far from innocent, the old commander had no choice but to uphold the law. Justice, as flawed as it was, still required him to carry out his duty. As they maintained their watch, a sharp-eyed officer spotted a lone figure emerging from the ruins. RNC stood motionless, his clothes soaked in blood, a grim testament to the chaos he had been through. Meanwhile, Chi-Chi finished her bath, only to discover that Q had gone to Kaijing Investment Company without telling her. Panic surged through her as she hurriedly grabbed her belongings, knowing something was terribly wrong. Clutching her umbrella, she rushed outside, determined to reach Q before it was too late. As she neared the towering building, her breath hitched at the sight of heavily armed policemen swarming the area. Before she could step closer, an officer blocked her path and firmly asked, "Are you Shishi?" His serious expression sent a chill down her spine as he informed her that she was needed for an urgent investigation. Without hesitation, the officer pulled out a photograph of Q and held it up for her to see. Shishi's heart pounded as she nodded. Yes, I know him. What happened? Is he still alive? She demanded. The officer's lips pressed into a thin line before he finally spoke. Not only is he alive, but he's also in perfect health. At that moment, within the high-security prison of the City Defense Army, an interrogation was already underway. Q sat calmly in his cell, his face devoid of emotion as the guards monitored him closely. An aging investigator had been keeping a close watch on Q, analyzing his every movement and reaction. The reports indicated that Q had admitted to attacking Kaijing Investment Company, but beyond revealing his name, he had provided no other details. Strangely, no official records existed for Q. It was as if he had materialized out of thin air. The only known connection he had was with Shichi. Upon further questioning, she revealed that they had first met inside the secret realm. Investigators soon began linking him to the mysterious intruder who had once infiltrated the Forbidden Grounds. The old investigator couldn't shake his curiosity. Q was an enigma, and he needed to uncover the truth. His next question focused on Shichi's background. His research led him to discover that Shichi was merely a level 2 healer, while her father had once served as a level 5 military professional. Further reports revealed that Shichi's sister had tragically fallen victim to the devastating disaster that struck the city years ago. When asked about Q, Shichi recounted their first encounter. Her team had been on the verge of exploring a secret realm when Q unexpectedly emerged from a portal. The commander soon learned that Q's attack on Kaijing Investment Company stemmed from their relentless attempts to pressure Shichi's family into selling their land. As this revelation sank in, the heavy doors of the briefing room swung open, and the director stepped inside. With a firm nod, he addressed the commander. It's time. We need to speak with Q face to face. Commander Jun, a formidable level 7 professional, exchanged a knowing glance with the director, who ranked just below him at level 6. Together, they were the city's most powerful figures. The tense silence was shattered as the door to Q's holding room slowly creaked open. The commander stepped into the room, his sharp gaze immediately locking onto Q's expression. However, he quickly noticed that Q wasn't looking at him at all. His attention was fixated elsewhere. His eyes were glued to the gleaming badges embroidered on the commander's cloak, as if they held a deeper meaning. With a heavy sigh, the commander took his seat and initiated the interrogation. He laid out Q's fate in clear terms. His crimes warranted the death penalty, or alternatively, he could serve on the front lines to atone. Freedom was a distant dream. Survival in battle was the only path forward, but no soldier had ever returned alive from the war's deadliest zones. Yet for someone like Q, fighting monsters on the battlefield wasn't a punishment. It was simply what he had always done, tied to his past as a warrior. The commander detected something strange in Q's response. He paused, then asked, "Have you ever fought on the front lines before?" Without hesitation, Q answered, "Yes." His voice was calm, unwavering. The director and the commander exchanged knowing glances. If Q was telling the truth, he was one of the few who had ever endured such brutal warfare. The commander leaned forward slightly and revealed that both he and the director had also fought on the front lines in the past. He had dedicated 10 years of his life to those deadly battles, while the director was a seasoned veteran. Only legends like Maersk and the first generation of heroes had served longer. As proof of his experience, the commander unfastened a metal badge from his uniform and held it up for Q to see. "If you've been in those trenches," he said firmly, "then you know better than anyone that committing this crime was reckless." He reminded Q that incidents like this had the power to destabilize the fragile peace they had spent decades maintaining. Worse yet, Q had been infiltrating the secret realms without any formal authorization from the government. This was no minor offense. It was a grave security breach that could undermine the entire system. Despite the weight of these accusations, Q remained silent, his expression unreadable. He offered no explanations, no justifications, just an unsettling absolute quiet. Frustration flickered in the commander's eyes as he realized Q wouldn't cooperate so easily. "Since you refuse to talk," he finally said, voice cold, "we can't offer you any leniency." Even so, the old commander held onto a sliver of hope that Q would eventually choose to speak. If he continued down this path, he would soon be transferred to the federal capital prison. Unlike here, the officers in the capital wouldn't afford him the same patience or treatment. Q's lips curled into a faint smile. He had heard of the federal capital before, and strangely, the idea of visiting it once more intrigued him. But at this moment, any thoughts of returning there seemed impossible. RNC had just been assigned a new mission, one that involved the infamous Great Ghost reincarnation. Years had passed since the disaster first struck the city, but the Great Ghost had never been truly eradicated. Now, it threatened to return, using the bodies affected by its previous radiation blast as vessels for rebirth. Q's primary objective was to eliminate this emerging catastrophe before it fully manifested, and in return, he would be rewarded with its powerful core. This being, often referred to as the Great Obscenity, was classified as a calamity-level entity, its strength rivaling that of professionals ranked between levels 7 and 13. Q had foreseen its eventual return long ago, back when he first defeated it, and had warned the government to keep a close watch on all those affected by its radiation. He had once tirelessly fought to preserve peace, traveling across countless regions to prevent similar calamities from wreaking havoc. Yet despite his relentless efforts, the day he saved Dodge City became a bitter memory. His only reward was public outrage. He had arrived just 10 minutes late, and for that, the people turned against him, hurling insults and claiming he was ungrateful for the authority bestowed upon him. Time and time again, Q endured the scorn, choosing instead to bow his head and apologize, seeking forgiveness for faults he never truly committed. But now, something inside him had changed. He no longer desired to be a hero. Mankind had pushed him too far. Whether people lived or perished, it no longer mattered to him. He had stopped caring. Meanwhile, the commander and director were still debating whether Q had truly experienced the horrors of the front lines. The old man finally spoke, reflecting on his decades of service. "I've seen many warriors," he muttered, "but never someone with his level of combat ability." Commander Zhang was certain Q's efficiency in eliminating his enemies at the Kaijing Investment Company had been nothing short of masterful. He wasn't just a skilled fighter, he was a prodigy in warfare, as if he had simultaneously mastered multiple combat disciplines. The director narrowed his eyes and asked, "Could Q be one of the rare geniuses of our time? There are only a handful of individuals who have ever reached that level of strength." The old commander exhaled deeply before responding. "Perhaps he is, but he's also a fool, sacrificing his own freedom just to take down that corrupt company. They weren't worth it." In the end, Q's fate was not theirs to decide. His final judgment would be in the hands of the Federation, the same governing body that had once overseen Mask's trial. Their ruling would take place in Star City, the Federation's capital, a metropolis built upon the ashes of humanity's near extinction. Now, Star City stood as a beacon of survival and progress, a place where technology had advanced to what could only be described as a science fiction reality. And within one of its high-security offices, a group of congressmen erupted into a heated debate, their voices filled with urgency and fear. Yao sighed as he glanced at the document in his hands. It was Q's crime report. Despite everything, he couldn't deny that the young man possessed extraordinary talent. Yet regardless of Q's abilities, Yao firmly believed that he needed to be punished. A person like him, unchecked, could become a serious threat to society. But the real reason behind Yao's insistence on punishment had little to do with justice. Qijang Company was one of his primary revenue sources in Dodge City. Letting Q go unpunished would send the wrong message to the other businesses under his control. After a brief moment of consideration, Yao made his decision. Q would be sent straight to the front lines, where the Federation's forces battled against the relentless tide of monsters. But even this punishment didn't fully satisfy Yao. What he truly wanted was for Q to be publicly executed, making an example of him for all to see. His concern was simple. If Q was allowed to live, his own subordinates might start questioning his authority and seeking ways to betray him. Abruptly, he shifted the conversation to another unresolved issue, irritation clear in his tone. It had been too long, and still no one had managed to locate Mask after his sudden disappearance during the trial. A heavy silence filled the meeting room. In an era where modern technology made it nearly impossible for someone to stay hidden, the lack of any trace of Mask was both baffling and infuriating. What Yao failed to realize was that Mask was closer than he could ever imagine, right in front of him, concealed under a different identity. Some of the other congressmen attempted to pacify their leader, assuring him that Mask had lost all his powers. But this argument only deepened Yao's frustration. If Mask was truly powerless, then how had he managed to vanish so effortlessly from the courtroom? One official hesitated before suggesting that perhaps Mask had used the last remnants of his strength to escape. This was precisely the narrative they had been feeding the public, a propaganda campaign designed to weaken Mask's influence. And so far, it had worked, drastically reducing his supporters. Yao finally exhaled, calming himself as he reassessed the situation. At this moment, he was the most powerful figure in the entire Federation. Yet despite his moment of confidence, he ordered the continued search for Mask. The mere possibility of his return was enough to keep Yao on edge. Moving forward, the discussion turned to another pressing concern, the alarming rise in monster activity at the front lines. Recent reports showed a staggering 32% increase in monster attacks this month alone. As the numbers sank in, Yao realized something unsettling. Without Mask, their forces were struggling to keep up. Eliminating him might have been a mistake. A thought crossed his mind. Had they pushed too far in their verdict against Mask during his trial? That single idea irritated him. It was as if someone in the room was questioning the wisdom of their decision, and he despised the implication. His frustration boiled over, and he lashed out, venting his anger at the gathered officials. "Do you all truly believe that humanity cannot survive without mask?" he snapped, his piercing gaze sweeping across the room. To counteract the worsening crisis, he issued an immediate order. Each city would reduce its standing military forces to reinforce the soldiers at the front lines. However, one congressman hesitated, voicing his concern. "Sir, if we redeploy troops from the cities, we leave them vulnerable. Those forces are stationed there precisely to handle sudden calamities." Someone scoffed, suggesting that the only reason this man opposed the troop redeployment was because he profited from supplying weapons to the city guards. And just like that, the room erupted into another heated argument. But in the end, none of them could challenge Yao's authority. His decision was final. The cities had seen no major calamities in years, and he was certain they could handle any emerging threats. As for Q, Yao decided that he should be transferred to the capital. Specifically, he was to be detained at the DOS City Defense Force headquarters. Meanwhile, Shishi had finished cooperating with the authorities. She had done everything she could to help Q, but it was clear now. There was nothing more she could do. Yet, deep inside, she refused to accept this grim reality. Q was being treated as a dangerous criminal, and she and her sister were being forced to serve as key witnesses in his trial. Chen Liu angrily confronted a female officer, calling the entire situation unjust. "Q only punished those who were the scum of the earth," she argued, but the officer remained firm. "Regardless of their crimes, taking lives is still considered murder." Frustrated, the younger girl protested, "But those people weren't innocent. They destroyed thousands of lives." Her voice trembled with emotion. Commander Jian, who had been listening, finally stepped into the conversation. "You're right," he admitted, nodding. "Those men were far from good. But even if they deserved their fate, Q had no right to pass judgment on them himself," he added firmly. Chen Liu clenched her fists. "Then tell me this. Why didn't the government act when they already knew about these criminals?" The old commander sighed. "Because there is darkness in this world that even the brightest light cannot erase. And sometimes sacrifices must be made." But Chen Liu wasn't satisfied with that answer. "It's not that you chose not to dispel the darkness," she countered bitterly. "It's that you simply couldn't." John frowned. "Your personal rebellion against the system is misguided." But Chen Liu had already reached her breaking point. "No," she shouted. "The very existence of this world is a mistake." She stood frozen, watching her sister with wide, stunned eyes. Without another word, they decided to head home. As they left, Commander John observed Chen Liu quietly. If only she had the ability to fight, he thought, she could channel all that hatred into destroying the true monsters of this world. But for now, she remained powerless, confined to mere words. By the time they reached their home, the weight of everything that had happened hung heavy between them. Shishi left Chen Liu alone, focusing on cleaning their yard while she secretly devised ways to help Q. But unknown to her, Chen Liu's thoughts were drifting towards something far more dangerous. Chen Liu still couldn't accept the way the world worked. If there were places that light couldn't reach, then she would become that light. With sheer determination, she managed to stand again. She even took a few unsteady steps forward. Meanwhile, Shichi remained focused on her cleaning, unaware of the change happening behind her. Then she saw her sister. Her breath hitched. Chen Liu was standing. But something was wrong. Vines began to emerge from Chen Liu's arms, writhing like living creatures. "Run!" Chen Liu whispered, then louder. "Run, Shichi!" At the security department headquarters, tensions were already high as officers debated the sudden reduction in their police force. Commander Jian had personally called the meeting to break the news and hear their input. But in the middle of the discussion, he felt something. A presence. His expression darkened. He knew this aura. "It's the great ghost," he muttered. The room fell into chaos. Officers stood in disbelief. "That's impossible," one of them stammered. "That calamity was destroyed years ago." Commander Jian didn't respond. Instead, he smashed the glass window with his fist. "Sound the alarm! Evacuate the civilians! Activate the emergency military protocol, now!" he barked. Meanwhile, in the bustling streets of the city, everything seemed normal. A man glanced up at the sky, admiring the early bloom of flowers. "Spring came too soon this year," he mused. The delicate petals unfurled, filling the air with vibrant colors. But something was wrong. The flowers weren't blooming because of spring. They were releasing something. Pollen. Thick golden clouds of it drifted into the air. A lone bee, drawn by the scent, hovered near the blossoms. The moment it touched the petals, its body twisted and changed. "Hey, it's time to cross!" the man's friend called. But when he turned to respond, his words caught in his throat. His friend's body convulsed. Vines burst through his skin. Leaves sprouted from his eyes. The man staggered back, horror clawing at his chest. He screamed. Others turned to look. One by one, the people around him began to change, twisting, writhing, becoming something else. something monstrous. A professional fighter arrived at the scene. The crowd erupted into cheers, believing salvation had come. Their hero stood tall, weapon in hand. He unleashed a powerful attack, sending thick clouds of smoke into the air. His strike tore through the massive pile of petals. It seemed like he had slain the monster, but then his arms began to twist. Vines sprouted from his skin, wrapping around his limbs like shackles. Horror spread through the onlookers. This monster's pollen was infectious. And just by looking at it, they knew it was the Great Obscenity. Officers were already mobilizing to stop the outbreak. Some doubted if this was truly the Great Obscenity. Unlike past disasters that rotted or disintegrated victims, this one turned them into plants. Commander Zhang silenced their doubts. This phenomenon is called human flowers, he declared grimly. Do not underestimate them. They will evolve into something far worse. Without hesitation, he issued his orders. Lock down all streets. Stop the infection from spreading. His team sprang into action, sealing off nearby areas and assisting civilians. But panic still reigned. People ran screaming as grotesque human flowers chased them down. Their roots slithered across the ground, ensnaring helpless victims. Get down! Commander Zhang roared. As the civilians hit the pavement, he took a deep breath, then unleashed a torrent of fire. A blazing inferno engulfed the entire street. Human flowers shrieked as they burned, their twisted forms reduced to ash. But even fire couldn't stop the airborne pollen. Zhang clenched his fists. This was worse than he had imagined. The monster's infection rate rivaled the Great Ghost's. In just a few short hours, the city had fallen. Ruins stretched as far as the eye could see, and above it all, thick vines curled around buildings, choking the life from the city. The director wiped his forehead, realizing the jungle around them was more of a green nightmare than a paradise. The soldiers fought against the relentless vines, hacking away as they pushed forward. Commander Zhang ordered his men to cease fire, knowing their bullets were useless against these monstrous plants. Even the tiniest fragment from the decayed remains of the human flowers carried the power to infect an entire village. The director approached an old man who seemed to have been expecting him. With a solemn nod, the old man confirmed that this catastrophe was none other than the Great Obscenity reborn. The director had witnessed its terror firsthand during its last attack on the city years ago. Commander Zhang speculated that only creatures with unnatural longevity could return from apparent destruction. Much like cursed demons reborn from the void, this monstrosity still required time to regain its lost might. This incarnation of the Great Obscenity was nothing like before. Previously, it had focused on pure annihilation. Now, its actions seemed aimed at purging humanity from the world, as if the planet itself sought vengeance. A memory resurfaced in the director's mind, something from years ago that unsettled him deeply. He recalled how Masked had ensured the monster's remains were to be completely eradicated after its defeat. However, corruption had won out. Officials had neglected their duty and had even stolen the funds meant for victims' families. The director clenched his fists, knowing that negligence had paved the way for this catastrophe's return. Commander Zhang dismissed his thoughts, urging him to focus on the immediate threat instead. With urgency, he turned to his team, demanding to know the location of the strongest energy signature. The director quickly realized what the old man intended. He was planning to confront the monster alone. Commander Zhang emphasized that they had a brief window to strike before the beast regained its full power. At this moment, it hadn't even reached the feared power range of level 9, or this was the only opportunity they had to vanquish the calamity before it could obliterate all of mankind. Knowing he couldn't dissuade him, the director could only urge Zhang to be cautious in his approach. Meanwhile, in Star City, chaos erupted as news of the unfolding disaster spread like wildfire. People gathered in fear, watching as live reports detailed the horrors taking place in the distant city. A frantic reporter confirmed the unthinkable. A calamity-level monster had emerged once more, threatening all in its path. The city's destruction was now being streamed across every major news outlet. Commenters online were frantically searching for the hero they had once shunned. Many speculated that the masked warrior would return to restore order. Meanwhile, social media was flooded with chaotic images and desperate pleas for help. Amidst the turmoil, reports emerged that Commander Zhang had engaged the monstrous entity in battle. With his elite unit, he fought fiercely, slowly tipping the balance in humanity's favor. The entire nation watched as the intense conflict unfolded in real time. On-screen, Commander Zhang evaded enormous, writhing vines chasing him down. Then, unexpectedly, he halted in place, unmoving. He had finally arrived at the heart of the disaster. Before him stood the true mastermind behind the chaos. Recognition flashed in his eyes. He knew this monstrous being. This creature was the architect of the calamity ravaging the city. It was none other than Shishi's sister, Chen Liu. Commander Zhang scowled, accusing her of using divine illusions to manipulate the masses. He recalled past battles where monsters masqueraded as gods to deceive humanity. A grim voice interrupted. His superior had confirmed that the beast before him was the reincarnation of the Great Ghost. Commander Jiang clenched his fists, stunned that she had transformed into a living catastrophe in mere hours. Chen Liu met his gaze and asked if he harbored any regrets. Without hesitation, the seasoned warrior's expression darkened. His aura flared as he roared that his only regret was sparing her life before. In a flash, Commander Jiang surged forward, closing the gap in an instant. Lightning crackled around him as he struck with full force. His attack connected, delivering a decisive blow to her monstrous form. Reporters watching the battle gasped, believing he had achieved victory in a single strike. But then, as Jiang turned, his triumph turned to dread. Despite the impact, his attack had left no lasting damage. Before their eyes, Chen Liu's wounds began knitting back together, her regeneration in full effect. Chen Liu smirked, telling Commander Jiang that his efforts were utterly futile. Within mere seconds, the damage he inflicted vanished without a trace. The monster stood before him once more, completely restored. Reporters watching the battle gasped in disbelief, unable to comprehend the situation. But the old warrior refused to falter. He launched another relentless assault. Bolts of lightning crackled around his fists as he delivered a barrage of punches. Each strike landed with devastating force, yet none left a lasting mark. Chen Liu's body mended itself almost instantly, rendering his attacks meaningless. With a mocking tone, she asked if this was the radiant light he once claimed could banish darkness. A sudden chill ran down Commander Jiang's spine as he sensed overwhelming bloodlust. Acting on instinct, he leaped backward, trying to create distance between them. But even as he strategized his next move, an eerie whisper reached his ears. Spinning around, he barely had time to react. Chen Liu was already behind him. Panic surged through him as he attempted to flee once more. Yet before he could even blink, the monster's shadow loomed over him again. She sneered, ridiculing the very light he had placed his faith in. Commander Jiang gritted his teeth. His attacks were meaningless against such power. No escape routes remained. The enemy's abilities defied conventional combat. As long as plant life existed, she could materialize anywhere in an instant. The director's urgent voice crackled through his communicator, advising immediate retreat. Even for a seasoned warrior like him, this battle had already been decided. The director suggested deploying large-scale bombardment to obliterate the entire battlefield. But Commander Jiang clenched his fists, rejecting the idea outright. "There's no running from this now," he muttered, determination burning in his eyes. With nothing left to lose, the old warrior cast aside his tattered cloak. His fingers traced the emblem on his mask badge, a faint smile forming. A memory resurfaced, one that reignited the fire within him. Chen Liu chuckled, acknowledging his resolve with an amused expression. Yet something had changed. Commander Jiang now radiated an even greater intensity. The once blue lightning engulfing him shifted, crackling with a deep crimson hue. This was his final gamble, his last-ditch effort to turn the tide. A colossal surge of red lightning erupted, slamming into his own body. Commander Jiang pushed his body past its limits, flooding himself with unstable elemental energy to amplify his strength. Everyone watching understood the grim reality. This technique came with a fatal cost. Once unleashed, it consumed the user's life force, leaving no chance of survival. Chen Liu, well aware of the sacrifice, chuckled and commended him for achieving level 8 power at the cost of his own existence. Yet his body was paying the price. His cells, unable to contain the surging energy, were breaking down one by one. Despite this, the old warrior showed no hesitation, his resolve burning brighter than ever. His movements blurred as he dashed forward, his enhanced speed turning him into a crimson streak. Chen Liu dismissed his charge, convinced she could simply teleport away like before. But before she could even register the thought, her body was nearly torn apart by his strike. Jiang had become so fast that his attacks outpaced her very ability to react. However, time was slipping away. His overcharged body was breaking down with every second. Pain racked his form as his cells continued to rupture under the immense strain. A hopeful reporter cheered, believing that Commander Jiang had finally vanquished the monstrous foe. But the truth was far grimmer. This battle was far from over. The sinister energy of the great ghost had not faded. Instead, it was intensifying. The director, his voice grave, revealed to his team that this enemy was not merely an ordinary abomination. He spoke of an ancient terror, one whose legend spanned back to the Greek Dark Ages. A creature deemed unbeatable, its name etched into myth and fear alike, Antaeus. As long as the earth endured, Antaeus would rise again, feeding on the lives it absorbed. The horror did not reside in a single form. It existed in every vine, every root, a being of countless bodies. Despite the explanation, many under the director's command still failed to grasp the full horror of what they were facing. Then a new emergency alert blared across their screens, escalating the panic. The monster's power surged uncontrollably, reaching a classified level of catastrophic energy. Before their eyes, Chen Liu ascended, no longer a level 8, but a level 9 entity, and she was still evolving. Meanwhile, the battle between the two warriors raged on, neither yielding an inch. Chen Liu, stunned by the spectacle, marveled at the lengths humans would go to attain such power through self-sacrifice. For once in her life, Chen Liu had once dreamed of using her strength to shield the weak from harm. Now she demanded an answer from Commander Jiang. Why had he, with all his power, abandoned those who needed him most? The so-called protectors had turned their backs, leaving the helpless to suffer, and this truth filled her with rage. In response, the countless human flowers entangled in the vines across the city began retreating all at once. They swarmed together, converging into a single point like an ominous storm gathering strength. Chen Liu had transcended once again, evolving into an even more terrifying form. Her body now towered over the city, standing as tall as the very skyscrapers that once overshadowed her. As dust and energy crackled through the air, Commander Zhang reappeared, preparing to give his final answer. Clutching all the remaining strength in his trembling hands, he declared that the world itself had made him this way. This was a world where death had become routine, where loss was merely another passing moment. With no hesitation left, Commander Jiang unleashed his ultimate attack, crimson lightning roaring from his fists like a storm of judgment. Chen Liu sneered, believing she could stop it with just one hand, brushing off his desperation. But she was mistaken. Against all expectations, Commander Jiang broke through her defense, piercing straight through her towering form. Across the nation, millions of eyes remained glued to their screens, witnessing this moment unfold. An eruption of cheers and gasps spread like wildfire as people saw his attack finally connect. Yet, despite the impact, Chen Liu was not done. Her monstrous body resisted, pushing against the force of his strike. Then, just as swiftly as it had surged, the overwhelming energy that had made Jiang unstoppable began to wane. His time had run out. Now caught within her grasp, he could feel the immense power squeezing the last breath from his body. She looked down at him with cold amusement, reminding him of his own words. If life and death were meaningless in this world, then he could now embrace his end. Commander Jiang could do nothing but stare back. There was no fear in his eyes, only a quiet acceptance of his fate. And then, just like that, he was gone. His body disintegrated into a flurry of delicate petals, scattered into the wind as if he had never existed. Chen Liu watched them drift away and scoffed, declaring that this was the price of defying the impossible. In the control room, the director clenched his fists as the realization sank in. The energy signature of Commander Jiang had completely vanished from their monitors. Meanwhile, across the nation, the audience sat in stunned silence, unable to process what they had just witnessed. And in that moment, their thoughts turned to the hero they had once cast aside, the masked warrior they had betrayed but now desperately sought. A full month had passed since his disappearance, and now the people were left in a state of helpless confusion. The weight of reality finally crashed down on them like a pile of discarded newspapers fluttering in the wind. Some had turned their frustration into anger, their voices rising in a chorus of discontent. Their outrage now targeted the federal government, blaming it for every failure that led to this disaster. And once again, the same desperate questions spread like wildfire. Where was Massacre? Meanwhile, at a high-security prison facility, blaring alarms shattered the tense silence, signaling an urgent crisis. Within the reinforced walls of this prison, Q remained seated, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. His patience was razor-thin, his fingers twitching as if ready to move the moment the chaos reached its peak. But despite his calm exterior, panic had begun to settle deep within him. For the past hour and a half, he had been attempting to reach the heroes under his command. Yet none had responded. Surrounded by trembling officials and terrified subordinates, he realized he was alone among cowards. A hushed voice cut through the tension, reminding Yao that perhaps they had been too ruthless toward Mask in the past. Those words hit him like a gut punch, leaving him momentarily speechless. Another voice chimed in, suggesting an extreme course of action. If we can't save the city, the person declared coldly, then we should just wipe it off the map. The sheer audacity of the idea stunned the room, sacrificing millions for the supposed greater good. For the first time, Yao saw these people for what they truly were, soulless strategists playing a cruel game. He could hardly believe the words coming from their mouths. Then, breaking the heavy silence, a new report came in, shifting the entire mood of the conversation. Yao immediately asked if a professional had been deployed to handle the catastrophe in the city. But as the incoming transmission played, a far stranger reality was revealed. A monster, one of their sworn enemies, had stepped in to defend the city. Back at the exclusive prison, destruction had already begun to spread. A massive slash now marred the once impenetrable walls of the facility. The impact had torn through multiple floors, exposing the building's deepest chambers. One of the guards stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. With wide eyes, he turned to his fellow officer, his voice barely above a whisper. I saw it. A monster just walked out of the prison. Back in the heart of the city, the soldiers remained stationed, watching over the area. They observed the return of the human flowers, a sight they'd seen before. Fearing the worst, some soldiers began fleeing, realizing they had no hope against the monstrous threat. However, the others stood firm, determined to carry out their duties and nourish the human flowers. The squad leader, a seasoned soldier, suddenly found himself ensnared by the vines. One brave soldier rushed to rescue his captain, only to be struck by a sharp black orb that appeared out of nowhere. The orb sliced through the air, cutting down the vines in its path. With the vines destroyed, the soldier and his captain were able to escape unharmed. Meanwhile, Chen Lu remained in her enormous form, her towering figure casting a shadow over the city as the reporters began to withdraw. One cameraman, however, thought he saw reinforcements arriving. A figure, clothed in a mix of red and black, charged straight toward the city's center. Many in the crowd assumed the figure was a hero sent by the federal government, praying that they had arrived in time to save Commander Zhang. Slashing through the chaos, the mysterious figure continued toward the great ghost. But as the crowd focused on the hero, they began to take note of his true identity. To their shock, it was our MC, returning to complete the task assigned to him by the system. His mission, to defeat this monstrous calamity once again, now in his monstrous form. Q quickly recognized the difference between this great ghost and the one he had faced before. The previous one symbolized pure destruction, while this one embodied the essence of life itself. The new form of the great ghost sought to consume everything in its path, creating a world devoid of sadness and pain, a twisted vision of ultimate evil. Despite the new form, Chu knew he had no choice but to defeat it. The monster's core was the key to battling the gods in the Void Realm. Determined, our MC knew he must do whatever was necessary to succeed. Chen Li began her crusade, commanding all living beings to merge with her. Spreading its vines once more, the great ghost extended its reach. With every soul it absorbed, she grew stronger, becoming one with the beings she had consumed. But soon the orbs that contained these absorbed souls began to burst, one after another. After a short while, most of the orbs had disappeared. Chen Lu immediately realized that someone was eliminating her subordinates. Her eyes locked onto the creature relentlessly cutting through her vines. Q had already recognized her. This monster had been brought forth for Chen Liu. But regardless of the circumstances, Q charged towards her without hesitation. Chen Liu, however, had no idea that the monster before her was Q. She was equally ignorant of the true nature of the creature attacking her. Determined to fend it off, she tried to eliminate the monster that threatened her. Q, on the other hand, was merely waiting for the right moment to strike. As soon as she raised her hand, both R and C sprang into action. Q unleashed a flurry of 1,000 cuts, then continued to press forward, closing the gap. At that moment, roses appeared in his path, aiming to block his advance. These roses would explode if anyone ventured too close. Thankfully, his armor allowed him to swiftly pass through the deadly flowers. Meanwhile, the cameraman continued to broadcast the intense battle for the public to see. The new monster's speed was astonishing, almost too fast to follow. A professional observer watching the unfolding chaos began to feel a sense of dread. Every attack and explosion that the monster faced, it evaded with ease. With speed, reflexes, insight, and agility beyond anything they'd seen before, it was unlike any threat humanity had encountered. For years, humans had relied on their intelligence and wisdom to stay ahead of monsters. But now, a creature had emerged that exhibited human-like qualities, leaving them fearful of the day monsters might surpass them. Back to Q, he was now dangerously close to Chen Lu, and with one powerful leap, he tapped into one of his abilities once more. With the spread of his wings, the greatest monster humanity had ever seen prepared to face down the great ghost. The emergence of his wings took Chen Lu by surprise. The crowd was left puzzled, wondering why Q hadn't used his wings earlier when the human flowers had exploded. One of the professionals watching the scene explained that it was a tactical move. Q had held back his wings to keep the opponent guessing, increasing his chances of disorienting her. However, such tactics came with risks. Only those truly confident in their abilities dared to employ them in high-stakes battles like this. R and C conjured the blood raven, slashing through the air with it, summoning a dark, bird-like shape that flew toward their opponent. The raven landed squarely on its target's head. The cameraman, capturing every moment, was ecstatic as he realized that Q's attack had been effective. The human flowers, which had been advancing toward Chen Lu, came to an abrupt halt. Some of them thought this was a sign that the battle had been won. But then, to everyone's surprise, the human flowers began to speak. They all asked the same question. Their voices echoed, demanding to know who Q truly was. Even while recovering, Chen Lu shared the same curiosity, as all the human flowers were interconnected. She too wondered why Q wielded the blood raven in his hands. But Q, ever silent, offered no answer. Chen Lu soon realized something. This monster was not just another creature. It was something far more. With this realization, she acknowledged that her opponent was also a monster of a different kind. Chen Lu, calm and composed, suggested that the two of them didn't need to fight each other. In fact, she offered the core of the great ghost to him as a prize, should they decide to join forces. This core was unique, capable of being used only by those who were recognized by the great ghost itself. Q considered her offer. It was tempting, no doubt. Chen Lu continued to urge Q, suggesting that together they could cleanse and reshape the world. She spoke of how they could become the change the world needed, altering its very fabric. Wherever there were places that couldn't be saved, they could simply destroy and rebuild anew. Her vision for the world was radical, but her mission had remained unchanged, to bring about the destruction of the world. The sound of countless human flowers reverberated through the area, their unified voices even reaching the cameraman perched high above. The cameraman, now uneasy, felt a growing fear. These monsters were communicating, working in unison. Q remained silent throughout the exchange. He had no intention of allying with anyone, whether human or monster. His singular goal was clear, to eliminate all the monsters. When Q didn't respond, Chen Lu interpreted his silence as rejection. With a firm resolve, she declared that it was time to decide who would remain in this world. Chen Lu was the first to act, unleashing her explosive ability, mirroring the actions of the human flowers. Q swiftly blocked the attack, his body protected by his defenses. But just as he thought he was safe, vines began to converge on him from all directions. He found himself surrounded. In that moment, Chen Lu gained the upper hand, pressing her advantage. Once she had regained her composure, she let out a terrifying scream that echoed through the battlefield. Meanwhile, Q closed his gargoyle wings again, but this time he used their alternate form to slice through the vines surrounding him. As the vines were torn apart, Chen Lu attempted to engulf him whole. Luckily, Q managed to dodge her attack just in time. Not only did he evade her strike, but he also moved quickly, maneuvering around her. With years of experience, having slain thousands of giants in his past life, he knew exactly where to strike. Within her massive form, he was certain that the true weak point was hidden somewhere. He didn't need to look inside her head. He already knew where it was. R and C continued their relentless assault, soaring toward Chen Lu with unwavering focus. Q summoned the Blood Raven once more, and used it to slash through the oncoming obstacles. Despite his efforts, vines relentlessly continued to grow, protecting the core of her body. Desperate to rid itself of Q, the great ghost resorted to its explosion skill once more. Q was caught in the blast, but his resolve never wavered. He pushed through the pain, knowing that this was his moment to strike the final blow. He could feel the intensity of the great ghost's attempts to defend itself. The more it fought to protect this particular part, the more certain Q became that this was the vital spot. He pressed on, knowing it was now or never. With relentless determination, he continued to slash through the defenses. Not long after he finally saw it, a glowing light deep inside. Q's instincts told him this was it, the core of Chen Lu. With one final powerful strike, he severed the last layer of defense. And there, before him, was the true form of Chen Lu. To his surprise, she had purposefully turned her body around. Just as the Blood Raven met her with precision, Chen Lu hadn't anticipated that this creature would defy all odds. But with his final strike, Q found himself completely drained of energy, already teetering on the edge of collapse. The monstrous vines of the creature caught him, preventing his fall. She began to contemplate what her next move should be against this formidable monster before her. Her thoughts focused on what to do with the creature looming in front of her. Even Chen Lu couldn't help but admire Q's striking features beneath his mask. Q was left speechless, unsure of how to process her compliment. She reassured him to take it easy, revealing that her defeat was inevitable, and that she was merely using her remaining energy to sustain her monstrous form. As her colossal body stood tall, the reporters assumed the battle was over, and they had lost. A tremor rippled through the air, unsettling everyone around him. The tremor was felt even by the soldiers and civilians below. To their horror, they watched something plummeting from the heavens. A blinding light was streaking downward, heading straight for the city. It was a nuclear bomb. Zhao had authorized this devastating strike as a last-ditch effort, his final card to play. In the back of his mind, Zhao couldn't help but regret his drastic decision. Chen Liu, Lu, and Q were appalled by the cold-heartedness of the monsters, willing to sacrifice the very civilians they had been fighting for. She made up her mind to act before it was too late, determined to make a statement before her demise. Shan Lu was resolved to reveal the true nature of the government to everyone, exposing the same authorities that had betrayed the masked warriors. With newfound determination, she returned to her towering form. The human-like flowers that had once been dormant began to stir, becoming one with her monstrous body. The vines shifted once again, reconnecting with one another, forming an intricate network of unity. Chen Liu stood tall as the transformation took place. Her arms reached out, stretching as if they were colossal branches designed to shield the city from any threat. It was as though her limbs had become immense trees, offering protection from all danger. The civilians gazed up in awe, witnessing the transformation. The monster, now a colossal tree, had assumed a new form to protect them. In an act of defiance, she intercepted the nuclear missile hurtling toward the city. All that followed was a flash of blinding light. The once vibrant human flowers were torn apart, reduced to nothing in an instant. The shockwave of the explosion obliterated them. Q was also caught in the devastating blast. But Chen Liu, in a final act of protection, wrapped him in her vines, shielding him from the worst of the impact. She had saved him, even in the last moments. This all occurred mere seconds after the nuclear explosion struck the city. The soldiers on the ground gave their all, deploying a massive energy shield to protect the citizens. They did everything in their power to shield the people from the catastrophic aftermath. It wasn't until then that the civilians came to a realization. The monster, the very creature they had feared, had actually protected them from the government's wrath. Back at the command center, reports flooded in, confirming that the energy from the great ghost had vanished. The news struck the director like a bolt of lightning, leaving him stunned. He quickly addressed Commander Jiang's soul, informing it that the city was safe and that the sacrifice had not been in vain. Still in disbelief, the staff couldn't fathom what they had just witnessed. They had been saved by a monster, the very thing they feared most. Slowly, the enormous tree that had taken shape began to unravel. It split apart, vanishing into the air. As it faded, delicate petals drifted from its branches, scattering across the city. The petals fluttered like soft whispers in the wind, painting the sky in shades of beauty. A woman reached out, trying to catch a petal as it fell, mesmerized by its elegance. She marveled at the sight, thinking to herself that it was one of the most beautiful things she'd ever seen, but a warning echoed in her ears. Someone cautioned that these petals could transform her into one of the monstrous creatures. To everyone's relief, nothing happened. She remained unchanged, unaffected by the strange petals. Meanwhile, Q stood by Chen Liu, holding her gently in his arms. He cradled her, the weight of the moment heavy between them. Chen Liu stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She spoke softly to Q, sharing her thoughts. For the first time, I see it now. Spring is truly beautiful. And with those final words, she began to fade away, vanishing into the winds. With Chen Liu's passing, the mission of the main character came to a close. He had conquered the reincarnation of the Great Ghost. As a symbol of his victory, the core of the Great Ghost was placed into his hands, the final reward for his arduous journey. The core resembled a pulsating green heart, glowing with an ethereal light. It shifted in shape, merging into something even more powerful. It was now the heart of Chen Liu herself. Q, without hesitation, embedded the core into his own body. As soon as it was connected, he felt an overwhelming surge of energy course through him. The moment the power flowed into him, Q was suddenly transported to another place. In an instant, he disappeared from the heart of the city. The people, unaware of Q's departure, celebrated their newfound peace, believing that Dodge City had finally overcome its calamity.